My parents said I owed them for raising me, then presented a fake contract claiming I agreed to pay their mortgage forever. I was 29 when my parents sat me down at their kitchen table and told me I owed them money for the rest of my life. At first, I thought it was a joke. My dad wasn't smiling. My mom had a manila folder in front of her. They told me they had sacrificed everything to raise me. They said I had benefited from their hard work for decades. Then my mother opened the folder and slid a document across the table. She told me I had signed it 3 years earlier. According to the contract, I had agreed to contribute to their mortgage indefinitely. Not for 10 years, not until retirement, forever. I laughed because it sounded ridiculous. Then I looked down and saw what appeared to be my signature. The laughter stopped immediately. I felt my stomach drop. The signature looked exactly like mine. My parents were serious. They claimed I was already 6 months behind on payments. They demanded nearly $12,000. When I refused, my father said they would take legal action. That was the moment I realized something was deeply wrong. 3 years earlier, I had gone through a rough period. I had just ended a long relationship. I was moving apartments. I was working 60-hour weeks. My memory of that year was a blur. That uncertainty terrified me. What if I had signed something without reading it? My mother immediately seized on my hesitation. She said she knew I would eventually remember. That comment bothered me. It sounded rehearsed. My parents had always helped me financially when I was younger. They paid part of my college tuition. They helped me buy my first car, but they had never treated those things like debts, at least not openly. I took photos of the contract and left. That night I stared at the document for hours. The language sounded strange. Some sections were overly formal. Others looked like they had been copied from internet templates. One sentence referred to me as both the beneficiary and the debtor. Another referred to my parents as a trust. They weren't a trust. They were 2 retired school employees living in a suburban house. The inconsistencies made me uneasy. The next morning I called an attorney. He reviewed the document. His first question surprised me. He asked why the signature appeared darker than the rest of the page. I hadn't noticed that. Now I couldn't unsee it. The signature looked freshly printed. The rest of the document looked older. The attorney suggested getting a forensic document examiner involved. At that point, I thought the mystery would end quickly. I assumed someone had forged my signature. I didn't expect what came next. A week later, my parents started calling relatives. They claimed I was abandoning them. They said I had promised to support them and was backing out. My aunt called me crying. My cousin sent angry messages. Suddenly, I was defending myself against accusations I didn't understand. Then another strange thing happened. My father sent me a spreadsheet. It listed every expense they claimed they had ever paid on my behalf. School supplies, doctor visits, birthday parties, summer camps. The total exceeded $300,000. At the bottom, he wrote one sentence. "You owe us far more than the mortgage." Reading that felt worse than the contract. I realized this wasn't just about money. Something else was happening. A few days later, the forensic examiner delivered preliminary findings. The contract had likely been assembled from multiple documents. Different sections had been created at different times. The signature appeared to have been copied from another source. The examiner couldn't say where it came from yet, but he was confident it wasn't an original signature. I expected relief. Instead, I felt confused. Why would my parents do this? They weren't criminals. They weren't stupid. There had to be a reason. Then I remembered something. About 4 years earlier, my father had asked me to sign paperwork related to a family insurance policy. I had signed several forms without paying much attention. The examiner asked if copies existed. I searched through old records. Eventually, I found them. The moment I compared signatures, my heart sank. They matched perfectly, not similar, identical, every curve, every angle, every tiny imperfection. Signature on the contract had been copied directly from one of those forms. I thought that would end everything. Instead, it created a bigger mystery. Why now? Why wait years? Why suddenly demand money? The answer started appearing through small clues. My parents became increasingly desperate. They called constantly. They demanded meetings. My father stopped talking about family. Everything became financial. Then my mother accidentally revealed something. She mentioned a second mortgage. I didn't know they had one. When I asked questions, she immediately changed the subject. That caught my attention. I began investigating their finances, not illegally. I simply started looking at public records. What I found shocked me. 3 years earlier, around the same time the fake contract supposedly originated, my parents had refinanced their home. Twice. Then they took out a large home equity loan. The amounts were substantial, far beyond anything they had ever mentioned. I confronted them. My father became furious. He accused me of spying. My mother cried. Neither answered my questions. That silence told me more than any explanation could. A month later, another clue surfaced. My younger sister called me late at night. She sounded terrified. She asked if our parents had requested money from me. I told her everything. There was a long silence. Then she confessed something. They had already asked her not for mortgage payments, for $70,000. She had refused. They claimed she was selfish. After that, they barely spoke to her. My sister also revealed something else. Our parents had been borrowing money from multiple relatives. Small amounts, 5,000 here, 10,000 there, always with emotional stories, medical expenses, home repairs, emergency situations. Nobody knew about the others. I started calling relatives. The pattern became clear. They had borrowed from nearly everyone. The total was enormous, but where had the money gone? My parents weren't wealthy. They weren't gamblers. They didn't take luxury vacations. Nothing made sense. Then my cousin shared a detail that changed everything. He mentioned a man named Victor. I had never heard the name before. Apparently, Victor had been visiting my parents regularly for years. Nobody knew exactly who he was. They described him as younger than my parents. Always wearing expensive clothes, always arriving in luxury vehicles. When I asked my mother about Victor, she froze. For a split second, I saw genuine panic. Then she claimed he was an old family friend. The lie was obvious. I hired a private investigator. Part of me felt guilty. Another part desperately needed answers. 3 weeks later, the investigator called. Victor wasn't a family friend. He was an investment promoter. He had convinced dozens of retirees to invest in various business ventures. Many had lost everything. My parents weren't victims. They were some of his earliest investors. Over nearly 8 years, they had poured money into his schemes. Retirement savings, refinancing proceeds, home equity loans, borrowed funds, everything. The numbers were staggering. I finally understood the financial crisis. But one question remained. Why? Forge a contract instead of admitting the truth? The answer came unexpectedly. My sister found old emails on a family laptop she still had access to. Most were ordinary. Then she discovered a folder, hundreds of messages, conversations between my parents and Victor. The emails revealed the entire story. At first, they had made money. Small returns arrived regularly. That convinced them to invest more. When the returns slowed, Victor blamed temporary market conditions. My parents doubled down, then tripled down. Eventually, they invested nearly everything. When losses appeared, they became desperate. Instead of accepting reality, they chased recovery. Each setback pushed them deeper. Every warning sign was ignored. Every concern was rationalized. The final emails were heartbreaking. My parents knew the investments were collapsing. They knew they might lose their house. They knew relatives would start demanding repayment. And then one email changed everything. My father wrote that their children had a moral obligation to help. Victor agreed. He suggested creating formal repayment arrangements, not legal advice. Just a suggestion, but it planted a seed. Over the following months, the emails became darker. My parents convinced themselves they deserved compensation. They reframed every sacrifice as an unpaid debt. Every birthday, every meal, every school expense. In their minds, parenthood had transformed into a financial transaction. The contract wasn't merely a forgery. It was the product of years of self-justification. That realization hurt more than the fraud itself. I brought everything to my attorney. The evidence was overwhelming. The contract was fake. The signature was copied. The claims were fraudulent. My parents backed down almost immediately once they learned experts were involved. But the damage couldn't be undone. Family gatherings became battlegrounds. Relatives picked sides. Some couldn't believe my parents would do such a thing. Others insisted they must have had reasons. The emotional fallout lasted months. Then came the final twist. Victor disappeared. Authorities began investigating. Dozens of victims emerged. Millions of dollars were gone. My parents weren't the masterminds. They were victims, too. That complicated my anger. They had lost nearly everything. Their retirement was devastated. Their home was at risk. Part of me felt sympathy. Another part remembered the forged contract, the threats, the lies, the public humiliation. Victimhood didn't erase those choices. About a year later, my mother asked to meet. We sat in a quiet cafe. She looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she admitted the truth. The contract had been my father's idea, but she had helped create it. She confessed they never expected experts to examine it. They thought fear alone would make me comply. I asked whether she ever felt guilty. She started crying. She said something I still think about. She said the scariest part wasn't creating the fake contract. The scariest part was how reasonable it seemed at the time. She genuinely believed I owed them, not because of the investments, not because of the mortgage, because they had convinced themselves that parenthood entitled them to repayment. Somewhere along the way, they stopped seeing me as their son. They started seeing me as an asset, a resource, a solution to their mistakes. That was the real loss, not the money, not the house, not the retirement fund, the relationship itself. Eventually, my father sent a letter, not an apology, an explanation. He described years of fear, years of watching savings disappear, years of convincing himself everything would recover. By the end, he wasn't defending the forgery. He was explaining how he became the kind of person capable of it. For the first time, I understood him. Understanding didn't equal forgiveness, but it answered the mystery. The fake contract wasn't born from greed. It was born from panic. Panic became entitlement. Entitlement became justification, and justification became fraud. Today, I still have a copy of that contract, not because of the legal case, not because of the money. I keep it because it reminds me how dangerous desperation can be. Every clue that once seemed mysterious now makes sense. The strange wording, the copied signature, the sudden demands, the spreadsheets, the emotional pressure, the attacks on my character, all of it came from two frightened people trying to escape consequences they couldn't face. My parents eventually sold their house. The mortgage they wanted me to pay no longer exists. Most of the borrowed money was never recovered. Many family relationships never healed. I speak to my mother occasionally, my father rarely. The contract never reached a courtroom, but it still changed everything. Sometimes people ask what hurt most, the forgery, the threats, the attempted manipulation. The answer is none of those. What hurt most was discovering that my parents had spent months constructing a document designed to prove I existed to serve them. And the most unsettling realization came later. If the experts hadn't examined the signature, if the contradictions had been less obvious, if I had been more frightened and less skeptical, I might have believed them. I might have spent years paying a debt that never existed. I might have funded a mortgage forever because the two people I trusted most had convinced themselves that love and obligation were the same thing. And even now, years later, that's the part that still keeps me awake at night.